So now let's move into how color is processed in the cortex of our brain. So one thing we do know is that there's no single module for color perception. There's no single place in the cortex or in the brain where we can say that this is where color perception happens. It doesn't work that way at all. Cortical cells that are in area V1 and V4 we have identified cortical cells in these areas in V1 and V4, the visual area 1, visual area 4, that do respond to preferentially to certain wavelengths. Or they seem to have opponent responses, much the way we saw neurons in the retina that have opponent responses. However, these cells don't just respond to colors; they also respond to different shapes and different orientations of geometric shapes. Also, cortical cells that respond to color may also respond to white. So there isn't one place, one cortical module, one region of the brain where color is processed. It seems to take place throughout the different regions of the brain. The two types of opponent process cells that we've identified in the cortex are the single opponent process receptive field and the double opponent receptive field. And basically what we have in this receptive field here, now remember the receptive field is the area that's on the retina. So we shine a green light on this spot in the on a spot in the retina, and ultimately in the cortex what happens is this a neuron lights up if we shine a green light on there on that receptive field that's attached to that neuron lights up. If we shine the green light here in the inside. If, however, we shine a red light on the outside of this receptive field, the neuron that's in the cortex reduces its output. And of course, a green light here and a red light here would produce output somewhere in the middle. There's also these receptive fields that are called double opponent receptive fields. So and the way they work is they're sitting next to each other. These receptive fields are sitting next to each other, and essentially, whenever this particular receptive field, this particular example here, whenever it's hit with medium wavelength light, that is green light, on this side, it gets stimulated. And whenever it's hit with red light on this side, it gets inhibited. Over here, the opposite happens. When it gets hit with red light on this side, it gets stimulated, but when it gets hit with green light on this side, it gets inhibited. So these, we have identified these neurons that respond in this manner, that seem to work in these opponent type processes. Let's see. I'm gonna skip that, just so we can move ahead a little bit. Okay, this is an example that's in your book. So basically, what you want to do is close one eye and then just stare at this color for a while. And what you're going to do is you're going to wash out your perception of red. You're going to basically bleach your perception of red so that your perception of red is inhibited a little bit. So close one eye and stare at this for about a minute or two. And then look around. Look at different color objects with the eye that was open, and then close that eye and open the other eye, the good eye that wasn't staring at that square, and see the difference in color perception that you're perceiving because you bleached out your red receptors. And what this demonstrates to us is this principle of related to chromatic adaptation, right? Prolonged exposure to chromatic color leads to the receptors adapting to that color and a decreased response to that color. With regard to color constancy, this ability of ours to see the same color under different conditions, there was a pretty famous experiment done by Uchikawa, where observers were shown sheets of colored paper in three conditions. So in the baseline condition, the control condition, the colored paper was shown in white light. In another condition, the paper was illuminated by red light, but the observer by white light. And then, so in other words, the observer was not adapted to the way the paper was being illuminated, because the observer was still in white, had a white light shined on him, but he was looking at this paper that had red light shined on him. And then in the other condition, both the observer and the paper he was looking at were both in red light. Now, based on this little experiment that you just did, what would you expect? So here's a picture of the experimental situation that was set up in the Uchikawa studies. We had the baseline condition, the observer not adapted condition, and the observer adapted to red condition. What we saw here was, of course, when you're looking at the green paper, and you're under the white light, and the green paper's under the white light, the paper looks green. When in the middle situation where you're not adapted to red light, in other words, you're still able to see red. You're still able to see red because your ability to perceive red has not been bleached out by being exposed to too much red, because you're under the white light here. But if we light up the stimulus with a red light, the paper color is shifted toward the red, so it looks a little bit more red, or a lot more red than you would expect. Here, what's happened is that we've bleached out or adapted our red receptors in the eye by illuminating the observer with red light, and of course we're also illuminating the stimulus with red light. So what happens here is that the paper is only slightly shifted toward red. It still looks the original color, but it's a little bit more yellow, slightly more yellowish than what you saw in the controlled condition. But nonetheless, the subject was able to identify what color it was. So what this study demonstrated to us is that we are able to maintain color constancy. In other words, we're able to identify what color something is in spite of changing light conditions. In other words, in spite of going from here to here, comparing these two conditions here, we're able to perceive more or less the same color. Color constancy works best when an object is surrounded by many different colors. So in other words, the colors kind of work together to maintain their own, or your brain actually organizes it such that the colors maintain their own color when there's a lot of different colors together. Also, going back to everything we perceive, or part of our method of perception is constructing what we expect to see. And sure enough, memory does play a role in color constancy, such that our past knowledge or past experience with a particular object is going to affect the color that we're looking at, the color that we perceive, I should say. So, for example, here we have a couple of images here, and the images are of a landscape, one with a lush summer view with lots of green and lots of flowers, and another one that's arid, where it's winter and everything's dead. If you show people lots and lots and lots of lush scenes, right? After you show people lots, and then ask them to adjust the color of an image to, raise the color up and down of an image to make it look like something they saw before, what you're going to end up with is this washed out effect. In other words, what's happened is that you've adapted them to lots and lots of different lush scenes. So after they've adapted to those, and then you ask them to adjust the color on a picture they've seen before to where it was, to where you think it was, or to where they think it was, I should say, they'll come up with something like this, which is different than the actual picture that they saw, meaning that they've adapted not only to the individual colors, but to the scene as a whole. And you also get that with the arid scenes as well. You can show them lots and lots of different arid pictures, adapting them to different arid scenes, and then if you show them one that they've seen before and say adjust the color to where you thought to where it looks like what you saw before, it's actually going to be a lot more washed out because they've already adapted to all of the colors that they've seen in those arid scenes. All right, so Hansen did a set of experiments where he wanted to try to understand what prior knowledge of an object does to color perception. And he compared that, and basically he did that by having people look at pictures of fruit versus a spot of light. And here's what he did. So first the observers looked at a spot of light that was next to a gray background. And the color was adjusted of the light. The color of the light was adjusted such that it was exactly the same as that background. And whenever the subjects looked at that, they're like, "Yup, that spot's gray. It looks just like that gray background, so it's gray, no problems, because it's just a regular little spot of light." But when they did this with the fruit, what they did with the fruit was they took the fruit and they physically made the fruit the same shade of gray as the background. The exact same shade of gray as the background. Physically made the fruit. So it was such that the fruit was just the same shade of gray as the background. However, when subjects looked at that, when they looked at the grayed out fruit against the gray background, they reported that the fruit looks slightly colored. So yeah, those bananas look gray, but there's a little bit of yellow there. And yeah, that tomato looks gray, but there's a little bit of red there, right? So even though physically the fruits were, the pictures of the fruit were set to match the grayness of the background, people were still perceiving the colors of those fruits. Even though those colors were not there, they were still perceiving them. Achromatic colors are perceived as remaining relatively constant. So those... God. So achromatic colors, like gray, white, and black, right? The colors that don't, the shades that don't have like red and green, right? That don't have different colors. Those are also perceived as remaining relatively constant. But it's relative. The perception of lightness and darkness is not a simple function of how much light is being reflected off of something and how much light is being blocked. The way it works is how much light is being reflected relative, or what percentage of light is being reflected relative to other things that are close to that object. So if you look at this, here's an example here. We have a chessboard being lit up by a light bulb and by the sun. So obviously the sun is going to provide a lot more bright light on a chessboard than a light bulb will. However, there's going to be a lot more light bouncing off of that chessboard from the sun than there would be from a light bulb. However, in spite of this, in spite of the fact that there's a lot more light, just absolute amounts of light bouncing off the sun illuminated chessboard, we still perceive them as this one is black and this one is white. In other words, the white one didn't get whiter in the sun. It's still white relative to the black. And again, it's the percentage, right? We went from 900 to 9,000 units going from black to white here, and from 9 to 90 units. The relative amounts are still the same, even though the absolute amounts have changed. So our perception of color constancy with the achromatic blacks and whites and grays is relative to how they look against each other. So there's a very simple principle here in light constantly called the ratio principle, and basically that um, you can have two spots or two areas that reflect different amounts of light. So you could have like a white area and a gray area. Um, and what you're going to end up with, you can make those two areas look the same if the light intensity ratio is the same as the different areas. So for example, if you have a gray area and a white area, and you illuminate the gray area with more light than the white area in a ratio that's consistent with how gray this is versus how white this is, you can make them look the same, right? So the gray area can be made to look like the white area if it's illuminated with a lot more light. And of course, the grayer it is, the darker it is, the more light you need. And that, of course, works when the objects are evenly illuminated. So if the light is coming from the same distance and hitting both objects exactly the same way. Um, when light is uneven, one of the problems that our brains, our perceptual system has to deal with is where lines and where objects begin and end. So we use the edges where reflected light changes to detect surfaces and edges. So if we see a dark ridge running down a surface, we'll know that it goes in, and so the light's not hitting it. So it must go inside. It must be a ridge that goes inside that particular surface. So we look for reflectance edges, the edges where the amount of light changes between two surfaces, and we look for illumination edges, the edges where the lighting of two surfaces changes, where there's more light than on one area than in another area. So in this example here, let me look at the legend real quick. So in this example here, A so this is an example of an unevenly illuminated image, and computers have a really hard time with this because they'll try to detect they'll try to call this, for example, like a piece of furniture or something, because they have a tough time detecting uneven illumination. So there's reflectance edges here between A and C, right? So they're both evenly illuminated, right? But there's a different object here and a different object here, right? They're different colors, I should say. And there's illumination edges between A and B. So we got the same object here, but A is being more brightly lit up than B is. We have to, and we need to understand, one of the things our brains apparently do is we have the ability to tell the difference between these illumination edges here and these reflective edges here. In other words, we can tell whether the light is different or we can tell whether the object is different, right? In this case here, the light is different. This is all part of the same panel in this wall. The light's just different. But in this wall here, we have two different panels. Even though the light's different, we can perceive two different panels here, and that's a reflective edge. Like I said, it's very difficult. It's a very complex operation that we're able to do very easily, but computers have a very hard time with that.